A millionaire laughed at the faith in Our Lady. One day, during a conversation full of mockery, something very bad happens. The Almighty God appears. He was a man of unquestionable success, rich, powerful, and convinced that everything in life was achieved only through effort and logic. For him, faith was a refuge for the weak, something worthy of contempt. But in a moment of arrogance, he dared to challenge what many consider sacred. He ridiculed a small statue of the Virgin Mary in front of everyone, turning devotion into a joke. Little did he know that this gesture would be the turning point. When health, fortune, and absolute control of his life begin to crumble, he will be forced to confront a reality he never believed existed. How far can you go without faith? And what happens when pride opens the doors to something much bigger and much darker? The sun was setting over New York City, painting the mirrored glass of the imposing Hawthorne Enterprises headquarters, building golden. On the 40th floor, Theodore Hawthorne observed the city he considered his personal kingdom. At 45, he commanded one of the largest business conglomerates in the country, the result of 2 decades of meticulous work and an obsession with absolute control. Mr. Hawthorne, the last guests have confirmed their attendance for tonight. Sarah, his assistant for 12 years, waited with a folder of documents. Your sister Hannah called again. She insists on bringing that statue, Theodore completed, rolling his eyes. Let her bring it, if it makes her happy. His tone verged on mockery. Anything else? You have a video conference with Dubai in 10 minutes. Theodore nodded, dismissing Sarah with a gesture. He sat down in his Italian leather chair, surrounded by expensive works of art and framed certificates. Every object in his office had been meticulously chosen to convey power and success. Night came quickly, and the Hawthorne mansion in the Hamptons filled with important guests. Businessmen, politicians, and celebrities circulated through the lavishly decorated halls. Hannah, his younger sister, arrived discreetly as always, carrying a small statue of the Virgin Mary in her hands. Little sis, Theodore hugged her with studied affection. You really brought that. It's important to me, Theo, Hannah smiled, her gentle eyes contrasting with her brother's hardness. Mom said a lot of things, he cut her off, grabbing another glass of champagne. But look where we are now. I built all this with work and intelligence, not with prayers. The party was in full swing when Theodore, already altered by drink, decided to make an announcement. He climbed onto a table, glass in hand, and his strong voice silenced the conversations. My friends, look what my dear sister brought to protect us. He raised the small statue, provoking an awkward silence. A piece of plaster that, according to some, performs miracles. Hannah felt her face burn with shame. Some guests began to shift uncomfortably. But do you know what the real miracle is? Theodore continued, his voice laden with sarcasm. Work, determination. I built an empire from nothing, without divine help, without the intercession of saints, just with this. He pointed to his own head. Theodore, please. Hannah tried to intervene, but he ignored her. So let's make a toast. He raised his glass even higher, to rationality, to science, and yes, to the Virgin Mary, who must be too busy to worry about our little earthly fortunes. With a brusque movement, he placed the statue on the table. Hannah, no longer able to bear the humiliation, left the party in tears. Several guests followed her, leaving the atmosphere heavy and embarrassing. The next morning, Theodore woke up with a slight headache, but satisfied with himself. He commented to his driver as he headed to the office, Some people are so fragile, Richard. Crying over a statue? While they pray, I multiply fortunes. That's how the world works. What Theodore didn't know was that that night would mark the beginning of a profound transformation in his life. The gears of fate were already in motion, preparing to challenge every certainty he had cultivated with such pride. The empire he built would begin to reveal its fragilities, and his most solid convictions would be put to the test in ways he could never have imagined. The sun set that day with a different, almost supernatural glow, as if the sky knew that something extraordinary was about to happen. In the Hawthorne mansion, the small statue of the Virgin Mary remained on the table, silent as the shadows of night began to lengthen through the empty corridors. Night was falling over New York City when Theodore finally left his office. The day had been particularly exhausting, with endless meetings and important decisions. As his driver navigated the city's chaotic traffic, he tried to ignore a strange sensation that had been pursuing him since the party. "Richard, can you turn up the air conditioning? It's hot in here." Theodore loosened his tie, feeling a growing discomfort. "Sir, the air is already at maximum," Richard replied, casting a worried glance through the rearview mirror. Theodore took out his smartphone to check some emails, but the letters seemed scrambled before his eyes. A sudden dizziness made him lean back in the leather seat. His hands began to tremble slightly. "Must be stress," he muttered to himself, but something in his gut told him it was different. Upon arriving home, he dismissed the employees and went straight up to his room. The mansion was silent, except for a distant and repetitive sound that he couldn't identify. It sounded like a whisper, like a prayer being recited in an unknown language. "Is anyone there?" His voice echoed through the empty corridors. No response. He decided to take a shower to relax, but upon entering the ensuite bathroom, he noticed something strange in the mirror. For a moment, his own image seemed distorted, as if there was a shadow behind him. He turned abruptly, but he was alone. The phone rang, startling him. It was Hannah. "Theo, are you okay? I had a horrible feeling." "Don't start with your superstitions, Hannah," he cut her off, but his voice betrayed an unusual insecurity. "I'm perfectly fine. I found the Virgin Mary statue thrown in the trash at the mansion." "How could you?" Theodore hesitated. He didn't remember throwing the statue away. Must have been some employee during cleaning. "Theo, you need to be careful. Mom always said—" "Enough!" he shouted, louder than he intended. "I don't want to hear about Mom or your beliefs. I have a company to run." He hung up the phone abruptly and sat on the edge of the bed. The room seemed colder now, and the shadows in the corners denser than normal. He tried to turn on the TV to distract himself, but it only showed static. That's when he noticed a movement out of the corner of his eye. In the large bedroom mirror, his image seemed different. He approached slowly, hypnotized by his own reflection. For an instant, he swore he saw completely black eyes staring back at him. A chill ran down his spine when he clearly heard a voice whisper his name. It wasn't just any voice. It reminded him of his mother's, but with a sinister distortion that made him recoil. At that moment, his legs failed. He tried to lean against the wall, but his muscles didn't respond. He fell heavily to the floor as an inexplicable paralysis took over his body. His mind, always so rational and controlled, was invaded by a primitive terror. The last sound he heard before losing consciousness was the distant tinkling of a rosary, as if someone was praying somewhere in the mansion. When the employees found him hours later, he was completely motionless, but his eyes remained open, fixed on the ceiling, as if they had witnessed something beyond human comprehension. The next morning, the country's main newspapers headlined, "The News: Theodore Hawthorne, business magnate, found unconscious in his mansion." As he was rushed to the most prestigious hospital in the city, no one noticed the small puddle of water that inexplicably formed next to his bed, nor the soft scent of roses that lingered in the air. At the hospital, doctors were faced with a unique case. All tests indicated that Theodore was perfectly healthy, but his body refused to respond to any stimulus. It was as if something or someone had simply turned off his connections to the physical world. Hannah walked through the white and aseptic corridors of Mount Sinai Hospital, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the private wing. After 2 weeks of inconclusive exams and confused specialists, she decided to take an action that she knew her brother would disapprove of if he could express his opinion. "Mrs. Hawthorne," a soft voice called her. Hannah turned and found a young woman of about 30, dressed simply but emanating a striking presence. Her green eyes conveyed a wisdom that seemed to transcend her age. "You must be Claire Light," Hannah extended her hand. "Thank you for coming." "No need to thank me. I'm here to help." Claire smiled serenely. "Can you tell me more about what happened to your brother?" As they walked to Theodore's room, Hannah recounted the events of the party and the subsequent collapse. Claire listened attentively, occasionally closing her eyes as if absorbing more than just the words. Upon entering the room, they found Theodore, lying motionless like a statue. The only sounds were the constant beeps of the heart monitors and the hum of the air conditioning. Claire approached the bed and gently placed her hand on Theodore's forehead. At that instant, the lights in the room flickered, and an inexplicable wind stirred the curtains despite the windows being closed. Claire took a step back, her eyes widening slightly. "He's not alone," she murmured, more to herself than to Hannah. "What do you mean?" Hannah felt a shiver run down her spine. Claire took a deep breath before answering. "There are presences here, some trying to help, others—" She hesitated. "Others not so much." At that moment, one of the machines began to beep frantically, but Theodore's vital signs remained normal. A doctor's laptop, left on a nearby table, turned on by itself, displaying a series of numbers that seemed to make no sense. "Hannah," Claire called, her voice now more urgent, "I need to know more about your family." "Your mother, was she devout?" "Yes, very much. She spent hours praying the rosary, especially for Theodore. She—" Hannah hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. "She made a promise before she passed." Claire closed her eyes again, as if listening to something distant. "A promise to the Virgin Mary." Hannah nodded, surprised. "How did you—" An intense scent of roses suddenly invaded the room, so strong that one of the nurses passing by in the corridor stopped at the door, intrigued. The walls began to drip crystalline water, forming small puddles on the floor. "This started happening at the mansion too," Hannah explained, her voice trembling. "The employees are scared. Some refuse to enter certain rooms." Claire approached one of the walls, touching the water droplets with her fingertips. "Holy water," she murmured. "It's a sign." At that moment, Theodore emitted his first sound in 2 weeks, a low, anguished groan. His eyes, although still fixed on the ceiling, began to shed tears. "He can hear us," Claire affirmed, "and there's someone else listening too." As if to confirm her words, an icy breeze cut through the room, carrying with it indecipherable whispers. The rosary that Hannah carried in her pocket began to vibrate inexplicably. "Hannah, I need you to tell me everything about this promise your mother made," Claire asked, her green eyes now completely focused. "Every detail could be important. And we also need to find out exactly when Theodore began to drift away from faith. Something tells me there's a much bigger connection than we imagine." Outside the hospital, dark clouds were forming in the sky, announcing a storm. In the hospital chapel, candles were lighting themselves, one by one, as if an invisible presence was preparing the environment for something important that was about to come. On the bedside table in the room, Theodore's cell phone turned on by itself, displaying an old photo, him as a child next to his mother, both smiling in front of a church. For a brief moment, the woman's face in the photo seemed to blink. The rain was falling mercilessly over New York City as Claire and Hannah rummaged through the old study in the Hawthorne mansion. The room, rarely visited since the matriarch of the family passed away, held decades of history in its dusty shelves and locked drawers. "Mom kept everything here," Hannah explained, opening an intricately carved wooden chest. "Letters, photographs, her diary. Theodore never allowed us to touch these things. He said they were just useless sentimental attachments." Claire ran her fingers over a series of old photographs. In one of them, a woman with a serene expression held a rosary while hugging a teenage Theodore. "Your mother, she had a special gift, didn't she?" Hannah stopped what she was doing, surprised. "How do you know?" "The photographs. There's a different light around her, and this scent of roses that appears out of nowhere. It's her signature." At that moment, a gust of wind made the windows shudder, and several sheets of paper flew around the room. One of them, yellowed by time, landed at Claire's feet. It was a handwritten letter, dated 20 years ago. "My blessed Virgin," Hannah read over Claire's shoulder, "today I make this sacred promise. In exchange for the protection of my son, Theodore, I will offer my daily prayers and dedicate my life to your service. I feel that dark forces surround him, attracted by his growing ambition." Claire closed her eyes, concentrating. "Your mother knew?" She could see beyond the veil. Thunder echoed in the distance and the lights in the mansion flickered. Upstairs, they heard the sound of something heavy falling. When they went up to investigate, they found an old family portrait on the floor, the glass broken in a peculiar pattern. "Look at this," Claire pointed to the cracks in the glass. "They form a symbol, and it looks like a signature." Hannah turned pale. This portrait, it was taken the day Theodore closed his first big deal. That's when everything started to change. In another room of the mansion, one of the oldest employees, old Joe, timidly approached the two women. "Ladies," he began, hesitant, "there's something you need to know. On the day of that photo, I saw Mr. Theodore talking to a strange man in the garden, a man I had never seen before, and never saw again." "What did he look like, Joe?" Claire asked, although her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Tall, elegant, but his eyes, they were like empty wells. And when he smiled..." The old employee shuddered. After that day, young Theodore changed. It was as if something inside him had gone out. Hannah found, among the scattered papers, a newspaper clipping from that time. The headline announced the meteoric success of Hawthorne Enterprises, but what caught Claire's attention was a figure partially visible in the background of one of the photos, a tall man in a dark suit, his face forever in the shadows. "Robert Montenegro," Hannah read the caption, "the man who became Theodore's right-hand man in the company." Claire held the clipping with trembling hands. "This man, he's not what he seems." At that instant, all the lights in the mansion went out. In the dark, they could hear the distinct sound of footsteps in the hallway, although they were alone on that floor. Hannah's cell phone rang. It was the hospital. "Mrs. Hawthorne," the nurse's voice was agitated, "your brother, he's talking, in his sleep, repeating a name over and over, Robert." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Theodore was writhing in his bed, his first manifestations of movement since the collapse. His words were almost inaudible, but a nurse carefully noted, "The contract, the promise, my soul." Back at the mansion, Claire found, hidden between the pages of Theodore's mother's diary, an envelope sealed with red wax. On the seal, the same symbol that had appeared in the cracks of the portrait. Inside, a single sentence written in elegant calligraphy. "Every success has its price, and the time has come to collect." The mansion clock struck midnight, and an icy wind blew through the corridors, extinguishing all the candles Hannah had lit. In the hallway mirror, for a brief moment, the image of a smiling man was reflected, a smile that didn't reach his empty eyes. The night at the hospital was silent, broken only by the constant sound of the machines. Claire remained by Theodore's bed, closely observing his facial expressions as he slept. Since he had started murmuring Robert's name, his dreams seemed increasingly agitated. "No, that's not what we agreed," Theodore muttered, his face contorted, in agony. "The contract, you said..." Claire held his hand, feeling it cold. At that instant, the lights in the room flickered, and a dense presence seemed to fill the environment. The scent of roses, which always accompanied the inexplicable events, was replaced by an acrid and suffocating odor. "He's coming," Claire whispered, squeezing the rosary in her other hand. As if responding to an invisible call, the door to the room opened slowly. Robert Montenegro entered, impeccable in his black suit, even at that hour of the night. His smile was courteous, but his eyes remained empty, like black holes in his face. "Miss Claire," his voice was soft as velvet, "I didn't know we would have company tonight." "I know exactly who you are," Claire responded, not moving from the chair. "Or rather, what you are." Robert laughed, a sound devoid of any joy. "Fascinating. Theodore always despised people like you, you know? People who believe in higher powers." He approached the bed, his steps making no sound on the floor. Yet here he is, surrounded by candles and rosaries. "What did you do to him?" Claire asked, although her eyes indicated she already knew the answer. "Me? Nothing beyond what he himself asked for." Robert stopped at the foot of the bed. "Theodore wanted power, success, absolute control. I merely facilitated the process." At that moment, Hannah entered the room, carrying the sealed envelope they had found in the mansion. Upon seeing Robert, she turned pale. "Ah, the letter." Robert smiled again. "Your mother was a very perceptive woman, Hannah. She saw through the veil, as they say. tried to warn Theodore, but he was, let's say, too focused on his goals. "You were there?" Old Joe, who was accompanying Hannah, spoke from the door. "On the day young Theodore changed, in the garden." "Extraordinary memory, Joe." Robert adjusted his tie. It was a productive meeting. Theodore had so much ambition, so much desire to prove his worth. It was so easy to convince him to sign. "Sign what?" Hannah asked, her voice trembling. "A simple agreement." Robert pulled a document from the inside pocket of his jacket. Guaranteed success in exchange for, well, let's say Theodore didn't read the fine print carefully. Claire stood up, still holding Theodore's hand. "You no longer have power over him. His mother's promise—" "Ah, yes, the famous promise," Robert interrupted, a shadow of irritation crossing his face. "An inconvenient protection, I must admit, but which became irrelevant the moment our friend here decided to publicly mock his faith. Quite convenient, don't you think?" The lights flickered again, and shadows began to move across the walls like living creatures. The air became heavy, almost unbreathable. "But now," Robert continued, his voice changing to something less human, "the time has come to conclude our agreement." At that instant, Theodore opened his eyes, but they were different, completely black, like Robert's. A supernatural wind swept through the room, knocking over equipment and extinguishing the candles. "He's mine now," Robert declared, extending his hand towards Theodore. Claire, however, didn't let go of the businessman's hand. She began to pray, her firm voice cutting through the darkness. Hannah joined her, and soon the scent of roses returned, stronger than ever. Amidst the chaos, a soft light began to emanate from Claire's rosary, growing until it illuminated the entire room. Robert's expression changed for the first time, revealing an ancient and supernatural fury. "This isn't over," he growled, his form beginning to dissolve into the shadows. "The contract is still standing, and there's more at stake than you imagine." When the lights came back on, Robert had disappeared. Theodore, his eyes still open, began to cry. For the first time in weeks, his voice came out clear and frightened. "Mom, forgive me." The morning arrived with alarming headlines in all. The financial newspapers: Hawthorne Enterprises under investigation, multi-million-dollar irregularities discovered, stocks plummet after allegations. The empire that Theodore had built was beginning to show cracks in its foundations. At the hospital, he could finally move his arms and legs, although he was still weak. His eyes, once empty, now reflected a mixture of fear and regret. Claire remained by his side, while Hannah participated in an emergency video conference with the board of directors. "How," Theodore asked, his voice still hoarse, "how did I not notice before?" "Pride blinds us," Claire responded softly, helping him drink water. "Robert Montenegro didn't just build your business empire. He orchestrated your spiritual downfall." On the laptop screen, Hannah faced concerned and hostile faces. "Gentlemen, I need time to clarify these accusations," she argued. "My brother is recovering and—" "There's no time, Hannah," interrupted Augustus Verus, one of the oldest board members. "The evidence is clear. Suspicious transfers, fraudulent. Contracts all signed by Theodore and Robert Montenegro." "But Robert is the executive vice president," Hannah protested. "He has decades of service to the company." "Robert Montenegro resigned this morning," another board member informed. "No one can locate him." In the hospital room, Theodore watched the meeting with tears in his eyes. He planned everything. From the beginning, his trembling hand reached for the rosary that Claire had left on the bedside table. "I sold my soul for an empire of sand." Claire watched attentively as Theodore held the rosary. The bead seemed to glow softly at his touch, and the scent of roses returned to fill the environment. "Your mother is here," Claire whispered. "She never stopped trying to protect you." At that moment, Sarah, Theodore's assistant, burst into the room. "Mr. Hawthorne, forgive the intrusion, but I found something you need to see." She carried an old folder, her hands trembling. "I was organizing the files when I discovered these documents." The folder contained old contracts, all with the same signature pattern they had seen on the sealed envelope from the mansion. Even more disturbing were the photos. At every crucial moment in Theodore's business, there was Robert Montenegro, his dark figure always in the background observing. He appears in company records dating back to 1940, Sarah explained, her voice hesitant. Always the same face, the same age, and first as a consultant, then as director, vice president. Hannah ended the video conference and joined them, examining the documents. How did no one notice this before? Because he didn't want us to notice, Claire answered. People like him are masters at manipulating perception, at making us see only what they want. Theodore tried to sit up in bed, his still weak body protesting. I need to fix this, I need to... First, Claire gently interrupted him, you need to strengthen yourself, not just physically. What do you mean? Robert still has power over you, Theodore. The spiritual contract you signed, we need to break it. Hannah was leafing through the documents when something fell to the floor, an old photograph of the church where their mother used to pray. On the back, a note in her handwriting, the place where chains can be broken. I remember that place, Theodore murmured, his voice choked. Mom used to take me there every Sunday before Robert appeared, Hannah completed. Thunder sounded in the distance, making the windows shudder. On the room's TV, all stations began to report an even bigger scandal. Leaked documents revealed a complex corruption scheme involving Hawthorne Enterprises in several countries. He's destroying everything, Theodore realized, clutching the rosary in his hands. Not just the company, but my reputation, my life. That's how he works, Claire explained. First he offers everything you desire, then he takes much more than you agreed to give. And now? Hannah asked, her voice trembling. Claire looked out the window where dark clouds were approaching. Now we begin the real battle, but we won't fight alone. The moment she said this, all the candles in the room lit spontaneously, and the scent of roses became more intense. On the wall, Theodore's shadow seemed to be using a rosary, even though his hands were empty. The small church of Our Lady of Grace remained practically unchanged, as if time had stopped in that part of Brooklyn. Theodore, still in a wheelchair, observed the simple facade with teary eyes. Hannah and Claire accompanied him, attentive to every reaction. 25 years, he murmured. The last time I was here was at Mum's funeral. The interior of the church was empty at that hour of the afternoon, except for an elderly lady who was lighting candles at the side altar. The aroma of wax and incense mingled with the now familiar scent of roses that seemed to follow the group. Mrs. Connie, Hannah called, surprised. You're still taking care of the church? The lady turned, her wrinkled face opening into a smile of recognition. Hannah and Theodore? Her eyes widened slightly. Your mother told me you would return. What do you mean? Theodore asked, intrigued. Your mother came here every day until her last day, Mrs. Connie explained, approaching. She always lit a candle for you and said, one day when everything seems lost, my son will come back home. Claire watched attentively as the lady spoke, noticing how the nearby candles flickered without apparent wind. Mrs. Connie, did you keep something that their mother left? The elderly woman nodded slowly. Come with me. She guided them to a small room at the back of the church, where old furniture accumulated under layers of dust. From an old wooden chest, she retrieved a package wrapped in embroidered fabric. She brought this a week before she passed, Mrs. Connie explained, handing the package to Hannah. She said it should only be opened when Theodore returned to the church of his own free will. With trembling hands, Hannah undid the fabric's bow. Inside, they found an old crystal rosary and a leather-bound notebook. Theodore immediately recognized his mother's handwriting on the yellowed pages. Their prayers, he said, his voice choked, and in prophecies? Your mother had a special gift, Claire explained, carefully leafing through the notebook. She could see beyond the veil that separates our world from the spiritual. And she saw what was to come. Thunder began to sound outside, and a sudden rain lashed the church's stained glass windows. The candles on the main altar all went out at once, leaving only those that Mrs. Connie had just lit. She wrote about a man in a dark suit, Hannah. Read, her voice trembling. About contracts sealed with more than ink. About a choice you would have to make, Theodore. At that moment, the church door opened violently, letting in a gust of icy wind. Robert Montenegro stood in the doorway, his elegant figure contrasting with the storm at his back. What a touching scene, His voice echoed through the empty nave. A family reunion in the house of the Lord. Theodore, you're full of surprises lately. Claire positioned herself between Robert and Theodore, while Hannah firmly held the crystal rosary. Mrs. Connie, showing no fear, began to pray quietly. You have no power here, Claire declared, her voice firm. No? Robert smiled, his black eyes glowing supernaturally. Theodore gave me power over him of his own free will. Isn't that right, my friend? Theodore felt something burn in his chest. The contract he had signed so many years ago seemed to pulse against his heart. But something stronger was also manifesting. His mother's prayers recorded in that notebook, decades of maternal pleas and protection. The contract, Theodore began, his voice gaining strength. You lied from the beginning. You never gave me any power, just the illusion of it. I built your empire, Robert roared, his voice losing its usual smoothness. No, Theodore responded, managing to stand up from the wheelchair for the first time. You built a prison, and now I understand why Mom prayed so much. The crystal rosary in Hannah's hands began to glow intensely, and the scent of roses became stronger than ever. On the wall, Robert's shadow began to writhe, revealing his true form. This isn't over, he hissed, retreating towards the door. You still have much to lose, Theodore Hawthorne. I've already lost enough, Theodore replied, tears streaming down his face. But now I'm gaining something much more valuable. When Robert disappeared into the storm, all the church's candles relit simultaneously. Theodore fell to his knees before the altar, sobbing like a child. Claire, Hannah, and Mrs. Connie knelt beside him, while his mother's notebook opened by itself to a specific page where a single sentence was written. A mother's love and the strength of faith are more powerful than any contract with darkness. Night fell over New York City like a heavy cloak of black clouds. In the Hawthorne mansion, Theodore sat in his old armchair in the study, leafing through his mother's notebook by candlelight. Claire and Hannah had insisted on staying with him, anticipating that this would not be an ordinary night. The more I read, Theodore said, his voice low and reflective, the more I realized that Mom knew everything, every choice, every step I would take. She tried to protect you until the end, Hannah replied, organizing the documents they had brought from the church. Even when you pushed her away? A particularly strong thunderclap made the window shudder. On the television tuned to a news channel, the headlines continued to be devastating for Hawthorne Enterprises. The fortune Theodore had built was crumbling, hour by hour. Mr. Hawthorne, Sarah entered the study hurriedly. I just received a call from the board. They voted for your permanent removal. Theodore nodded calmly, surprising everyone. It was inevitable. Robert planned everything meticulously. But there's more, Sarah continued, hesitant. Robert Montenegro has scheduled an extraordinary meeting for tomorrow. He says he has a proposal to save the company. Claire stood up abruptly. It's a trap. Certainly, Theodore agreed, but it's also my last chance to face him on my own turf. At that moment, all the lights in the mansion went out, leaving only the candles lit. The scent of roses emerged, stronger than ever, accompanied by an icy wind that made the flames dance without extinguishing them. He's here, Claire warned, holding her rosary firmly. The elegant figure of Robert materialized in the shadows of the study. His usual smile was present, but there was something different in his eyes, a glimmer of desperation, perhaps. Theodore, my friend, his voice was smooth as always, I've come to offer you one last chance, an opportunity to save everything we've built together. That we built? Theodore laughed bitterly. You built an illusion, Robert. A sandcastle that's crumbling. I can rebuild it, Robert approached, his presence making the air denser. Bigger and stronger than before. The scandals can disappear. Your reputation can be restored. Just renew our agreement. Outside the mansion, the storm intensified. Lightning illuminated the sky, casting distorted shadows on the walls of the study. And what would be the price this time? Theodore asked, though he already knew the answer. Robert smiled, pulling a new contract from his jacket. The same as always, your soul, but this time without divine interference, without maternal protections, just you and me as it should have been from the beginning. Claire stepped forward. "You're desperate, Robert. The power you had over him is breaking." "Silence!" Robert roared, his voice momentarily losing its human tone. Turning back to Theodore, he continued more softly. "Think carefully, my friend. Everything you've achieved, everything you are, do you really want to throw it all away because of some prayers and candles?" Theodore stood up, holding his mother's notebook close to his chest. "You're wrong, Robert. For the first time in a long time, I'm not throwing anything away. I'm recovering who I really am." The candles in the study increased in intensity, and the scent of roses became almost intoxicating. On the wall behind Theodore, his shadow seemed to have another figure beside it, the unmistakable silhouette of his mother. "Don't you realize," Robert hissed, his form beginning to distort, "without me you are nothing, without me, without you." Theodore interrupted him, his voice firm. "I am my mother's son again. I am the man she always prayed I would become." At that instant, a strong flash illuminated the entire study. When the light dimmed, everyone saw something extraordinary. The contract Robert was holding was in flames, but a fire that didn't burn the paper. It only revealed hidden words, written in an ancient and sinister language. The true clauses, Claire explained, finally visible to mortal eyes. Robert, for the first time, showed true fear. His elegant face began to show cracks like a mask about to break. "This doesn't end here," he threatened, retreating into the shadows. "Tomorrow, at the meeting, you'll have to make your final choice, Theodore, and this time there will be no turning back." When he disappeared, the lights in the mansion gradually came back on. Theodore fell into his chair, exhausted but determined. "He's right about one thing," he said, looking at Claire and Hannah. "Tomorrow everything will be decided, but it won't be the way he expects." In the open notebook on his lap, a new page had revealed itself, as if it had just been written by his mother's hand. "The greatest power lies not in what we possess, but in what we are capable of renouncing out of love." The boardroom on the top floor of the Hawthorne Enterprises building was packed that morning. Executives, lawyers, and board members anxiously awaited the start of the extraordinary meeting. The day had dawned strangely dark for a time when the sun should have been high. Theodore entered the room leaning on a cane, accompanied by Hannah and Claire. In his pocket, he carried his mother's crystal rosary and a page from her prayer notebook. Several board members were surprised to see him. It was the first time he had appeared publicly since his collapse. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert Montenegro's voice sounded from the head of the table, "I thank you all for your presence at this crucial moment for our company." Eyes turned to him, impeccable in his black suit. On the wall behind him, a large screen displayed graphs showing the company's stock plummeting. "As you can see," Robert continued, "we face an unprecedented crisis. However, I have a solution." He smiled, his black eyes glowing supernaturally. "A complete restructuring, which will save not only the company but all of our reputations." "At what cost?" Theodore asked, his firm voice echoing through the room. Robert feigned surprise. "Theodore, I'm glad you came. In fact, your presence is fundamental to what I propose." With an elegant gesture, Robert made a folder of documents appear before each board member. Claire noticed that for a brief moment, his hands seemed like claws as he distributed them. "A new agreement," Robert explained, "transferring all shareholder control to an international holding company. The scandals will disappear, the stocks will recover, and everyone will maintain their positions, strengthened even." The board members leafed through the documents with growing interest. Their eyes seemed slightly glazed, as if they were hypnotized. "And who will control this holding company?" Hannah asked, also noticing the altered state of those present. "I will, naturally," Robert smiled, "with Theodore as, let's say, special consultant." At that moment, Claire stood up. "Show them, Theodore. Show what's behind the pretty words." Theodore took from his pocket the small vial of holy water they had brought from the church. With a quick movement, he sprinkled a few drops on the nearest contracts. The words began to writhe on the pages, revealing ancient symbols and sinister promises. "What is this?" one of the board members asked, his stupor beginning to dissipate. "The truth," Theodore answered. "The same type of contract I signed 20 Years ago, without knowing I was selling much more than shares, Robert stood up abruptly, his figure seeming to grow in the shadows of the room. Enough of this farce. Do you have any idea what he's throwing away? The empire we built? That you built using our family, Hannah confronted him. Using my brother's ambition, taking advantage of the absence of our mother's protection. The lights in the room began to fail, and a supernatural wind stirred the papers on the table. Robert no longer cared about maintaining his human appearance. His eyes were now completely black, and his skin seemed to crack like old porcelain. Your mother, he growled, that irritating woman with her endless prayers. Do you know how long I waited for her protection to weaken? How many years I observed this family, waiting for the right moment? The scent of roses began to fill the room, and the rosary in Theodore's pocket emanated a comforting warmth. And now, Robert continued, his voice distorted, when I finally have everything within my reach, you decide to regain your faith? Your conscience? It's not too late, Claire intervened. It's never too late to choose the path of light. Robert laughed, a sound that made the window panes shudder. Light. I offer real power, real wealth. He turned to the board members. Look at these contracts. Everything you've ever dreamed of can be yours. Just one signature. Some of those present seemed tempted, their eyes again taking on that glazed look. But Theodore stepped forward, leaning on his cane. I've had all that, he declared. And you know what I discovered? That true power lies not in what we possess, but in what we are capable of renouncing out of love. As he spoke these words, the same ones written by his mother in the notebook, an intense light began to emanate from the crystal rosary. The scent of roses intensified, and everyone in the room could feel a loving and protective presence. No, Robert roared, his form now completely distorted. You can't do this, the contract. The contract demanded my soul, Theodore responded calmly. But my soul was never really yours to take. It always belonged to something greater. At that instant, a golden light invaded the room through the windows, dissipating the shadows that surrounded Robert. His elegant face contorted into a mask of fury and despair. This isn't over, he threatened, his form beginning to dissolve into the shadows. You may have regained your soul, Theodore Hawthorne, but your empire, your precious empire, can crumble, Theodore completed, because now I know there are more solid foundations on which to build a life. When the light dissipated, Robert had disappeared. The contracts on the table disintegrated into ashes, and the board members seemed to awaken from a long trance. Outside, the day finally cleared as if an eclipse had come to an end.